Buenos días. Oh, I'm with familia, I could tell. This is wonderful. Thank you for the honor of being with you this morning, the invitation that came through your pastors, both of them, who are friends, who sometimes we hold each other in prayer, and we go through thick storms. I also want to say thank you to my mentors that are here. There are a number of you here. I would not be at MCC, I keep saying this to people, if it weren't for someone like Bill Braun, who decided to invite me to serve on the board with MCC on the West Coast. And then I found myself on the national board, and I have to tell you, it was a treat to travel with him because he had special privileges at airports that I too got to enjoy. It was a joy to dive into some work, ways of serving others in need around the world, and hearing the good news of our efforts together. I want to thank those who I've sat in classes and taken some of your courses, and those who have mentored me, like Lynn. Thank you, Lynn, for all the ways in which you have blessed me, you and Donna. Yes. Today, as we were singing, "Do Not Be Afraid," I was reminded that there are two staff members today that are at La Roca Church in Sanger. Our staff members are actually immigration caseworkers because we were asked from that pastor, Sam Resendez, to help with his congregation, prepare them, because most of them are in fear. Think about, what is the place of the church in times like this? And I said to Sam when he called me this week, "Hey, Dina, I'm doing this," and he talked about the Nisi Bureau of Farmers also heard about this and wanted to present at his church. And I said, "So what are they going to say?" And he says, "Actually, they're ticked off. They want to go blow some steam." And I said, "Well, church is a good place to blow some steam." It is, especially if you're siding with people who are hurt. This morning, I also want to say that thank you for these quilts, these comforters, and every stitch done with love. People around both Canada and the U.S. continue to use this as a way of saying to the world, you are not forgotten. You are loved. This one here reminds me actually of today's story, the story of Joseph and the coat of many colors. I almost feel like we can have a model today, just put it on and take a picture and say, look at the way we express that even here today. Thank you. Thank you for that. This morning, the story of Joseph in the book of Genesis is one that is common. As a matter of fact, I remember years and years, like we do a little song around this story, and it's one that it expresses almost an impossible situation. It really does. His story is such a miraculous. I remember that DreamsWorks, I think it was, created Joseph the Dream, right? The Dreamer, and created its own little videos and movies around his life being a dreamer. I also think about my dad. When I was young, my dad and mom were pastors of a church, and I remember him sharing one time about a family who had moved into the neighborhood and needed to find a new church. And so they started doing church hopping, that's the thing. Which one fits better with some of our beliefs or some of our traditions, language? And so he told the story of this one family who decided that they'd go to this one church and try things out. And they had a Sunday school class, just kind of like we had for children here today. So they sent their son, young guy, to the Sunday school class, and lo and behold, they were sharing about the story of Moses crossing the Red Sea. And the dad had given him a quarter, so just in case they have a collection there, he'd be able to get that. And finally, after the service was over, on his way home, dad's driving, mom's there, the kids are there, and so dad asked the question, "Did you learn anything in Sunday school today?" And he said, "Yes, I did." "Well, what did you learn?" "Well, Dad, they talked about Moses and the Red Sea." And he goes, "Oh, that's good. And what did you learn about the Red Sea and Moses?" And he says, "Well, they had to cross this Red Sea. So they brought in helicopters to bring in and help people from one side of the sea to the other. And the dad was like, what? And he says, yes. And then they brought the boats because they needed more help. And so the boats would helping people cross the Red Sea. And the dad was pretty sure this was not good theology. And he said, son, are you sure? And he said, well, Dad, if I told you the truth, you wouldn't even believe me. That's how we read Scripture. If it weren't there, and if it weren't for God's word, I'm not sure I'd believe it either. But today we look at the story of Joseph. What did we before us? Let's see. Let's touch a little bit about this story. The family actually has a history of some dysfunction. Those of you who are psychologists, y'all can probably give the sermon better than me. But there's something going on in this family, right? Let's back up for just a moment before we go to chapter 45 and go before and say, what had the place been like where Joseph grew up? So here it is. Joseph's father's Jacob, also known as Israel, right? He had several wives. Polygamy, I guess, was acceptable back then. So glad it isn't today. Just saying. But his wives had 10 other sons and maybe some daughters as well. But Jacob had his favorite wife, Rachel. And because of that, the son Joseph was also favored. He was a favored child, right? And so he grew up with older brothers, maybe sisters as well. But Joseph himself kind of had this thing about, Dad likes me more than you. I don't know about you, but some families also practice those kinds of experiences. Sometimes we have a little favored here or favored that, maybe because you behave better and the other one isn't quite as willing to follow along. And so it's easy to say things like, you're my favorite. I know both my kids ask me that all the time. Mom, am I your favorite? And so luckily I say, you're my favorite daughter. You're my favorite son. And then it's over. Like, thank God I don't have 2 girls or 2 boys or anything, right? I could say that to them. You're my favorite. And mind you, I had twins. I don't know if you know my story, but I had twins. And so Samuel is 1 minute older than Becca. So he keeps insisting that she should submit because he is the older child, you know, and the older children have privileges. There's also in the story the brothers, right? I would understand the brothers in this story actually have some power. They're older, right? They can probably do and act and do. And so in our culture, really the older brother is to care for the younger ones. That's kind of what we expect them to do. Like, you know, you have a second child or a third child and you ask the older one to help bring the diapers or be involved in their lives, to care for them. And in this particular dysfunctional family, we don't really see that. We see pushing back. We see a stream of jealousy that shows up in the older brothers. As a matter of fact, it becomes so strong that they begin to have some ideas around what they should do with their brother. What about getting rid of him? What about killing him? Today, their act would be quite criminal. They trafficked him. They took him away, put him in a hole, and eventually they sold him. That would be criminal today. Joseph himself, the oldest child of Rachel, he himself was also embraced somewhat this favoritism. I'm not going to say he was like, you know, a perfect child, because there was a part of him that was like, you know, nagging on the others. As a matter of fact, he's like, look at my coat of many colors. Or he would be in the field and he'd come back and he'd tattletale. That's a no-no in some cultures. You just don't tattletale. But that was Joseph. And then there's us, reading this story many, many generations later. Some of us can relate to the conflict of what happens when things don't go right, or the parenting skills don't show up in a way that is healthy relationships, where the divide is so great that hate becomes centered of these relationships. Some of us have maybe been on both sides. Maybe we didn't always treat our siblings the way we should have. Or maybe we were not treated the way we should have. In my particular family, we had a couple of rules. One of them was boys can get away with everything and girls can't. I don't know about you, but that's the way it was. Guys could go play, they could enjoy life, and we had to kind of be home and take care of stuff. And we're like, why? And it was kind of like, well, you're the girl, you got to learn how to cook, and da-da-da. And I'm like, well, what about him? What about them? I had an older brother who could play baseball, and I couldn't play. The only thing I was allowed to do was be in the band because it was an instrument. And they were like, okay, you could do that. But there was a lot of difference in how we were treated in my own household. Yes, the story of Joseph. So after this, he gets obviously sold into servitude, and Joseph is falsely accused of trying to rape the mistress of the household. Think about this. Some of us kind of think like sometimes we have bad luck. Just a couple of days ago, Rocio and I were on a little trip somewhere, and it felt like, man, one little thing after the other. You forget something, you got to go pick it up, and on your way back, your window got cracked with a rock from the person in front. You're like, man, am I just having a bad day? I feel like Joseph was having a bad life, right? To be rejected, even when you shared your dreams. Well, maybe because you were trying to show off. I don't know. And he could have been a jerk about it. I don't know. But he was having a bad life. Gets sold off, gets accused of raping someone, and ends up in prison. Could God do anything there? Well, some folks go to prison because they've done something. And some folks end up in prison because they resist an injustice. On my way in today, I was seeing a little TikTok thing on someone by the name of John Lewis, the U.S. representative who served 17 terms. His life didn't start as a U.S. House of Representative. His story starts much earlier, in the place of being the oppressed, in the place of being the target, rejected. He starts in a place where he can't hold to this and has to push back, and ends up doing in 1963, walking the Selma to the march to Selma, Montgomery to Selma march, Selma to Montgomery march. Yeah, John Lewis didn't have it easy. In some of those spaces, he was beaten, but not because, right? Because he was evil, but because he wanted to create an opportunity of equity for the people he saw daily, his community. So Joseph's in prison, but in that space, he has the opportunity to encounter God. See, there's a difference between holding to something, bitterness and anger, or finding a way to move forward. I'm not going to say it's easy. Forgiveness is not easy. As a matter of fact, there are steps to forgiveness. As we look at his specific life, Joseph at the end of his life doesn't pretend that nothing happened. As we read the chapter 45, he doesn't just excuse his brothers and like, oh, you know what? Nada, olvídate, nothing happened. As a matter of fact, he does not excuse the wrong. He begins to test it with his younger brother, Benjamin. Let's see if all these years have caused them to change. See, forgiveness is not minimizing the wrong as well. Sometimes we're like, well, boys will be boys. All right, it's okay. That's the way folks are exposed. And sometimes our judicial systems tend to minimize things with one particular group, but not with another. Yeah, we've seen that. Some of the work of MCC this week has actually been to visit some of the restorative justice spaces in places like Oakland, places like San Francisco, where there's been a history of police brutality and the community. So we had some staff members across the U.S. come and visit and think through, what does it mean to work for restoration? Sometimes forgiveness is not to take the blame for what's wrong. Joseph did not say, it's okay, boys, I know it was my fault. I should have never worn my fancy robe of colors. I should never have told you about my dreams. Sometimes in the dynamics of just trying to end something, a fight, I think about the women specifically who are abused in relationships, who they just, after they've been hit, kind of walk away like, I'm sorry I made you mad. Walk away feeling they have no power. Forgiveness does not mean that Joseph had to take the blame again for what had happened. No matter what he said or did, it did not excuse what his brothers had done. Extending forgiveness is hard. I want us to look at a different angle as well today. I want us to look a little bit about the power dynamic. Who had power and when? When Joseph was young around his family, and he was feeling a little bit powerful and feeling a little privileged because his dad favored him, he didn't always do what was right with his power. Let's look at him for a minute. When have we thought about, when did we have privilege? When did we have power? And in which ways have we used our powers? I hate to say it, but today's national leaders are not the best models for power. As a matter of fact, it's really disheartening to realize that when you get to a level of leadership and it's all about self-centeredness, there's nothing there that benefits the entire community. Power. Initially, Joseph had power. And maybe what he was doing to his brothers, again, he must have been rude, you could say whatever. But then there's a moment when his brothers have the power, right? His brothers have the power because they're older, they're actually physically stronger, and what they do with their power, right? It isn't that they go and they try to bring him along, help shape his thinking, find a way of educating or helping him see that the value of all people. Actually, his brothers did the opposite. Again, today what he did would have been considered a criminal act. Kidnapping, trafficking. But the beauty of this entire story does not lie in the beginning, but in the end. In the final scene here, when we look at the book of Genesis, he says to his brothers, I am Joseph. He reveals himself after all that he's gone through. But he reveals himself in a way that he is no longer bitter. He is no longer broken. He's no longer vengeful. Those areas, even though I could think about him when he was in prison, probably like, man, why am I here? If it weren't for my jerky brothers, I would not have been here. I could have been with my father, right? But something happened in his encounter with Jesus that it begins to show up, even in the most places of difficulty and pain. I think God had been with him. The promise of God had been with him, that after he was in prison, he began to receive God's favor of being in a household and actually responding and showing, revealing his gifts of dreams, right? So even when he ends up in Pharaoh's palace and he begins to share this dream of what the meaning of the dream was, Joseph understands that this gift that he has is not his own. It is God who reveals to him what that dream meant. Joseph. I'm Joseph. And then his humanity. Is my father still living? Doesn't matter what happens, you're going to have one papa, one dad. Mine is with Jesus. He's been gone 20 years, almost 20 years. but my dad, very instrumental in who I am even today. Yes. The next part of that story is, but his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. None of us are exempt. We don't get a free pass. If we've done something, right, there's going to be a time where we have to acknowledge our own ways and our own complicity in whatever things are. I think about our nation. In which ways has the church been complicit in where we are today? We look at the nuclear family of Joseph and the dysfunctions of this, but our national family also has some dysfunctional dynamics. Some folks want to erase history because it doesn't favor a certain perspective. So the best thing to do is get rid of things. In the conference that Rocio and I were this week, we had a mere discussion around what does it mean to erase history? Who begins to be the truth tellers in some of these spaces? And in which ways is the church courageous when the communities of institutions of higher learning can no longer be as clever to share the stories? Is the church courageous and able to do that? In verse 4, Joseph said to his brothers, "Come close to me." Wow. When God has done the work in our lives, when he has allowed us to see beyond the present, we can now begin to act upon what he intends for the greater good. In this particular case, Joseph, in that prison, began to understand that God's plan was for him to be able to save his own generation. God had promised Abraham, his great-grandfather, that he would have his nations would be blessed through him. And it was Joseph who, because he was willing to let go of the bitterness and embrace God's promise and God's faithfulness, that he was able to, at the end of this story, to invite his brothers and his fathers to come and live in Egypt. And they could survive the next 5 years of famine because Joseph was willing to let go of the bitterness. Today, we are up a battle as the church. There's so much around us. There's so many things that hijack our energy. As a matter of fact, I'm exhausted from all the news reports that are coming out of our nation. It seems like the fire has just been lit here when there's 5 more fires going on. And in which ways do we, the church, respond? Is it this fire? I know personally for the work of MCC, our phone has not stopped ringing on needs for immigration support. We've been in, I think I mentioned in my report this week, I think we're up 500% in our phone calls and our trainings of churches and communities on knowing your rights. 500%. We still have the same staff. It's just more work, a lot more work, because there's fear among our communities. And it's not just fear for those who are undocumented. It's fear for those who are connecting to somebody who's undocumented. It's also anger of those who decided that their pocketbooks would benefit greater and was a choice over relationships. Difficult. How in the world will we move forward? Church, today I just want to say a couple of things. The Anabaptists have a story that we need to tell. A story of endurance. A story where folks survived an incredible amount of oppression. And now there's other groups that are experiencing that oppression today that need to hear from you that it is going to be okay, because at the end of the day, God is on the throne. I met with a pastor, a local pastor, who was sharing with me that his congregation, again, is fearful. And then he said to me, if they want us to go, we shall go. Because we will take God with us. And we will share wherever we may land. That's different. That's facing fear and saying, you're not going to overtake me. I'm going to decide that wherever God goes, I will follow. Wherever his leading is, I will follow. Church, we would need you. We need each other in moments like these for you to share your power of story, your power of endurance and survival with those who need to hear hope. We also need you to use your power to call out systems of injustice. What did John Lewis say? It's time to get into some good trouble. You didn't hear that from MCC, by the way, okay? That's a me thing, all right? It's time for some good trouble. How do we use ourselves and get into some good trouble? Because at the end of the day, we want to show up. And if we have scars from things that we have had to endure, we want to be able to say, it's because we got in good trouble. Joseph, the dreamer, became the instrument that God used because he chose forgiveness. Today, we need to look at our lives. Where do we forgive? Where have I been wronged? Do I continue to hold on to that? Or do I let go so God can now establish a new relationship and heal what has been broken? As a nation, how do we forgive ourselves and others? How do we ask for forgiveness? And I think the only way forward is to be truth tellers. That is the way forward. And to our global world, I just want to say the impact of our faithfulness. 2 years ago, I was in Ethiopia. I was in a prison of 1,800 individuals. 90% of them were men. And of the men, 80% of them were there because of murder. Okay, I used to work in an institution of juvenile justice, juvenile hall, before I got kind of placed back on a stream of positive spaces. It was difficult to work in a prison. You see a lot of negativity. It's difficult. But to be in a place where 80% of the people are there because of murder, wow. And so this particular prison I was in northern Ethiopia, the church, the Mennonite Church, the Christos, Montes Christos, was there teaching and training on restorative justice work. And they had gathered people from the village and trained them, what is a way forward? Is forgiveness a way forward? And so we got to witness, a couple of us that were there, the interactions between an offender, a person that had killed the brother of another individual. And we got to experience the forgiveness of each other. Part of what was challenging to hear in that setting was that if someone is killed in your family, the expectation of the community is that you respond with the same criminal act that you've been impacted by. So it's an expectation from the community that if someone was killed, you'd kill somebody else. I'll end with this story. This gentleman that I met in that prison, his nephew had been at a bar, and he was sitting next to his best friend. And they were both a little drunk, and one strikes the other. And the one that was struck hit the ground, and he injured his head, and he died. Immediately, the family of the victim expected for one of their members to kill a member of the best friend. Mind you, these are best friends. So the word got out that they should hide because there was a group of folks, a mob that would come and try to kill somebody. Well, the uncle of this young man had 2 young boys, and he was in the fields. And when he got word that there was a mob looking to kill somebody related to his nephew, he took his sons and he hid. But before he did that, he went and got his father's old gun. And he grabbed it just in case something was going to happen. And he took it and he hid. Well, as they heard the mob coming, his 12-year-old son was afraid, got up and ran. And his son is running through the fields, and the mob began to shoot. And as this father's move, he wants to protect his son, he grabs his gun and he shoots at the mob and kills this man. What he didn't know is he killed the man who was trying to stop the mob from coming to hurt anyone. And he ends up serving a 30-year prison for killing this man. And it's in that space that this man, at probably, I think he was like already 10 years into prison sentence, is visited by the brother of the man that he killed. And there was reconciliation between them both. And because of that, the prison overseers and the laws began to take notice of the impact of that relationship. And what they've done now is they've said, if you've been reconciled to your offender and a victim, we can now say time served. As long as the victim is able to take you back to his community and introduce you as a brother. We have work to do here in our own systems of criminal justice. Let us choose forgiveness. There's much work to be done. Let's not be distracted by all these things coming out of Washington. Let's be faithful in what we can achieve as God's people. Amen.